The heart that feels most broken often holds the greatest capacity for love. When we've lost everything we thought mattered, we discover what truly does. At 69, Abram Stoltzfus had weathered enough storms to know that providence works in mysterious ways. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him at his estranged brother's abandoned gas station. With his farm failing and debts mounting, Abram reluctantly traveled to claim the only inheritance his English brother had left him, a crumbling roadside station that hadn't pumped gas in years. He expected rust, broken dreams, and maybe enough scrap metal to pay off his creditors. Instead, he found 5-year-old Naomi hiding in a storage closet, clutching a handmade doll and speaking only in frightened whispers. As Abram gently coaxed the child from her hiding place, he discovered she might be more than just a lost soul. She could be the granddaughter he never knew existed, abandoned by a troubled family, fleeing dangerous debts. But why would someone leave an innocent child in such a desolate place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist still clung to the Pennsylvania countryside when Abram Stoltzfus hitched his mare. Patience to the weathered buggy. His calloused hands, marked by decades of honest labor, trembled slightly as he adjusted the leather reins, not from the October chill, but from the weight of what lay ahead. The letter from the English lawyer had arrived 3 weeks ago, its crisp white envelope stark against the pile of overdue bills on his kitchen table. "Your brother Jacob left you his property in Millerville," the letter had stated in cold, legal language. Jacob, a name Abram hadn't spoken aloud in 37 years. Not since the day his younger brother had packed his few belongings and walked away from their family's farm, choosing the English world over the plain life their father had built with his own 2 hands. The rhythmic clip-clop of Patience's hooves on the asphalt road provided a steady counterpoint to Abram's churning thoughts. His wife Sarah had passed 4 springs ago, taking with her not only his greatest joy, but also his strongest reason to keep fighting the mounting financial pressures. The small dairy operation that had sustained 3 generations of Stoltzfus men was failing, victim to corporate farms and changing markets that favored quantity over the careful, traditional methods Abram refused to abandon. "Pride goeth before destruction," his father used to say, quoting Proverbs with the certainty of a man who'd never questioned his place in God's plan. But what happened when that pride was all that stood between a man and the complete dissolution of everything his family had worked to build? Abram's barn needed a new roof before winter. The milk equipment required repairs he couldn't afford. The bank's letters had grown increasingly stern, their patience wearing thin like an old coat. The countryside rolled past in familiar patterns, neat farmhouses with clotheslines heavy with simple garments, children walking to the one-room schoolhouse with lunch pails swinging, men already in their fields despite the early hour. This was the world Abram understood, where a man's word was his bond, and neighbors helped neighbors without expectation of reward. But it was also a world that seemed to be shrinking with each passing year, pressed in on all sides by the English world's relentless advance. As Patience pulled the buggy onto Route 30, Abram felt the familiar pang of moving beyond the boundaries of his community. Cars roared past, their occupants sealed behind glass and steel, rushing toward destinations he couldn't fathom at speeds that made him dizzy. The noise, the exhaust, the sheer urgency of it all pressed against his senses like a physical weight. He'd made this journey once before, 30 years ago, when his mother had begged him to find Jacob and bring him home. "He's still your brother," she'd whispered on her deathbed, her fingers clutching Abram's shirt with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll try." But Jacob had refused to see him then, sending word through a neighbor that he wanted nothing to do with his backward family. The rejection had cut deep, leaving a scar that time had never quite healed. Now Jacob was dead, killed in a car accident 6 months ago, according to the lawyer's letter. No wife, no children, just the abandoned gas station on the outskirts of Millerville that he'd bought 20 years ago with dreams of making it profitable. Dreams that had apparently died as surely as Jakob himself, the lawyer, a thin man with expensive shoes and impatient eyes, had been blunt during their single meeting. "Mr. Stoltzfus, I'll be honest with you. The property isn't worth much. The station's been closed for years, and the building needs significant work. Your brother had some debts, nothing that would transfer to you, of course, but it explains why he let the place deteriorate. You could probably sell it for enough to cover the back taxes, maybe have a little left over." A little left over. The phrase echoed in Abram's mind as he guided patients through the increasingly unfamiliar landscape. Even a small amount might be enough to fix the barn roof, to buy him another season on the farm. It wasn't much to hope for, but hope, he'd learned, didn't require much to survive. Sometimes just the smallest crack of light was enough to keep a man moving forward. The sign for Millerville appeared like a punctuation mark in the story of his journey. Population 1847, established 1889. The town had the weary look of a place that had seen better days. Main Street stretched before him, lined with more empty storefronts than occupied ones. A few local businesses stubbornly persisted. A diner with faded yellow awnings, a hardware store with paint peeling from its wooden sign, a small grocery that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. Abram pulled into the parking lot of the diner, needing a moment to gather his thoughts and perhaps get directions to Jakob's property. The English customers inside stared openly as he entered, their conversations faltering at the sight of his plain black coat and flat-brimmed hat. He was used to such attention, but it never grew comfortable. To them, he knew he represented either quaint nostalgia or stubborn resistance to progress. Depending on their mood, the waitress, a woman about his own age with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, approached with a coffee pot already in hand. "You must be the Amish fellow come about the old Miller station," she said, setting down a cup without being asked. "I'm Dorothy. Knew your brother some." The casual mention of Jacob caught Abram off guard. "You knew him?" "Sure did. Jake used to come in here for breakfast most mornings when he first bought that place. Had big plans, he did. Was going to turn it into one of those vintage gas stations, you know. The kind tourists like to photograph. Even had some fellow from Lancaster come look at it once, talking about using it in some movie or commercial." She poured the coffee, its rich aroma, a small comfort in the strange surroundings. "Jake was a dreamer, I'll give him that. But dreams don't pay bills, and that place needed more work than he could afford. Last few years, he pretty much kept to himself. Shame what happened to him." "The accident," Abram said quietly. "Icy roads last March. Jake never was much of a driver, even in good weather. Always going too fast, like he was trying to outrun something." Dorothy's expression softened. "He mentioned having family in the Amish community. Never thought I'd actually meet any of them. We weren't close," Abram admitted, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. "Family's complicated," Dorothy said with the wisdom of someone who'd seen her share of human frailty. "But blood's still blood, even when it's been diluted by time and stubbornness." After finishing his coffee and getting directions to the gas station, Abram climbed back into his buggy with Dorothy's words echoing in his mind. The property was only 2 miles outside town, but those miles seemed to stretch like years as he contemplated his first glimpse of his brother's final dream. The Sunoco sign came into view first, its red and blue paint faded to pale suggestions of their former brightness. The building squatted beside the road like a tired old man who'd sat down to rest and never gotten back up. Windows were boarded with plywood that had warped and weathered to the color of old bones. Weeds had claimed the concrete islands where gas pumps once stood, their metal skeletons rising from the green chaos like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. This was Jakob's legacy, a monument to ambition undone by reality's harsh mathematics. Abram felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced when surveying his own failing farm. How many dreams did a family have to bury before admitting defeat? He tied Patience to a fence post and approached the building with careful steps, testing each board for stability before trusting it with his weight. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, its glass long since shattered and replaced with cardboard that had absorbed years of weather. Inside, afternoon light filtered through cracks in the plywood, creating a cathedral of dusty beams that illuminated the skeletal remains of Jacob's hope. The space was larger than it had appeared from outside, but emptier too. Shelves that once held motor oil and snacks now held only shadows and the occasional empty beer bottle, evidence of trespassers who'd found temporary shelter in Jacob's abandoned dream. The smell was overwhelmingly musty, tinged with the ghost of gasoline and the sweeter scent of decay, but it was the sound that stopped Abram cold, a soft whimpering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He stood perfectly still, ears straining against the silence. There it was again, faint but unmistakably human, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. "Hello?" he called softly, his voice echoing strangely in the empty space. "Is someone there?" The whimpering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Abram moved toward the sound, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the gritty concrete floor. A doorway led to what had once been the station's service bay, now empty except for an oil-stained floor and the rusted tracks where the garage door had once rolled. Another door, this one barely visible in the shadows, led to what appeared to be a storage area. The whimpering came again, definitely from behind that door. Abram's heart hammered against his ribs as he reached for the handle, unsure what he might find, but certain that whatever it was would change everything. The door opened with a screech of protest, revealing a small room lined with metal shelving. And there, huddled in the farthest corner, like a wounded animal seeking the darkest possible hiding place, was a child. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, her dark hair matted and dirty. Her clothes, a faded pink dress that might once have been pretty, torn and stained. But it was her eyes that made Abram's breath catch in his throat. They were the pale blue of morning sky, exactly like his mother's eyes, exactly like Jacob's eyes, exactly like his own. In her thin arms, she clutched a handmade doll with careful stitches and button eyes, holding it like a talisman against all the darkness in the world. "Hello, little one," Abram whispered, his voice gentle as summer rain. "What's your name?" The child pressed herself deeper into the corner, her small body trembling like a sparrow caught in a sudden storm. She didn't answer Abram's gentle question, but her eyes, those achingly familiar blue eyes, tracked his every movement with the wariness of someone far too young to understand such caution. Abram slowly lowered himself to his knees, making himself smaller, less threatening. The concrete was cold and unforgiving beneath him, but he'd endured worse discomforts in his 69 years. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, using the same tone he'd once used to calm frightened animals. "My name is Abram. What's your name, little one?" The girl's grip tightened on her doll, and for the first time, Abram noticed the careful craftsmanship in the small toy. The fabric was worn, but not cheap. Good cotton, probably from a feed sack sewn with the kind of precise stitches that spoke of someone who took pride in their needlework. The doll's face was embroidered with care, its button eyes sewn on with double thread that had held despite obvious wear. "That's a beautiful doll," Abram observed, staying perfectly still. "Did someone special make it for you?" The child's lips moved, but no sound emerged. She tried again, and this time Abram heard the faintest whisper, "Mama." The single word hit him like a physical blow. Where was this child's mother? How had she come to be alone in this abandoned place? The questions crowded his mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the immediate need to earn this frightened little girl's trust. "Your mama made that doll?" he asked gently, a barely perceptible nod. "She must love you very much to make something so special." Abram shifted slightly, reaching slowly into his coat pocket. The movement made the girl flinch, but she didn't retreat further. From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden toy, a horse he'd carved years ago for a grandchild who had never come to visit. The wood was smooth from handling, polished to a warm honey color. "I made this," he said, placing the wooden horse on the floor between them. "Would you like to see?" For the first time, genuine curiosity flickered in those blue eyes. The child leaned forward slightly, just enough to get a better look at the carved horse. It was simple but well crafted, with flowing mane and tail that suggested movement even in stillness. "His name is Thunder," Abram said, gently pushing the toy closer. "He's very gentle, but he likes to run fast when the weather is nice." The girl reached out tentatively, her fingers barely brushing the wooden mane before jerking back. But the contact, brief as it was, seemed to break some invisible barrier. She spoke again, her voice like dried leaves rustling. "Hungry," Abram's heart clenched. How long had this child been here? How long since she'd had a proper meal or clean clothes or the comfort of adult care? "When did you last eat, sweetheart?" She held up 3 fingers, then seemed to reconsider and held up 4. 4 days. Abram asked, horrified. She shook her head and pointed toward the boarded window, then held up the fingers again. 4 sunrises, perhaps? Or had she lost count entirely? Either way, it was far too long for a child to go without food. Moving carefully, Abram stood and stepped back toward the door. "I'm going to get you something to eat, all right? I'll be right back. You stay here where it's safe." The panic that flashed across her face nearly broke his resolve. She scrambled to her feet, still clutching her doll, and took a hesitant step toward him. "Come with me if you'd like," he said gently. "But we need to get you some food." The child followed him through the abandoned station, staying several feet back, but keeping him in sight. Outside, the afternoon sun seemed harsh after the building's dim interior. She squinted and raised a hand to shield her eyes, and Abram noticed how thin her wrist was, how the dress hung loose on her small frame. Patience stood patiently by the fence post, and the girl's eyes widened at the sight of the mare. It was the first expression of wonder, rather than fear, that Abram had seen from her. "This is Patience," he said, stroking the horse's neck. "She's very gentle. Would you like to pet her?" The child approached cautiously, her free hand extended. When Patience lowered her great head to sniff delicately at the small fingers, the girl actually smiled, a brief, radiant expression that transformed her entire face and made Abram's chest tight with emotion. The drive back to town was surreal. The child sat beside him on the buggy seat, still clutching her doll, but no longer trembling. She stared at everything with wide eyes, as if seeing the world for the first time. Perhaps in some ways she was. At the diner, Dorothy took one look at them and immediately understood the situation. She bustled them to a corner booth and appeared moments later with a plate of scrambled eggs, toast and bacon, along with a glass of milk that she set in front of the child without a word. The girl attacked the food with a desperation that confirmed Abram's worst fears about how long she'd been alone. She ate with her hands, stuffing food into her mouth as if afraid it might disappear. Only when she'd consumed nearly half the plate did she slow down, suddenly self-conscious about being watched. "It's all right," Abram said softly. "Eat as much as you want." Dorothy slid into the booth across from them, her expression grave. "Abram, we need to call someone." "Child services, the police." "Not yet," Abram said firmly. "Give me some time to understand what's happened here. You can't just please." The word carried decades of dignity and quiet authority. "A few hours. Let me at least find out who she is." Dorothy looked from Abram to the child, who had stopped eating and was watching their conversation with obvious anxiety. "A few hours," she agreed reluctantly. "But then we involve the authorities." After the child had finished eating, Abram carried her back to the buggy. She'd fallen asleep at the table, exhaustion finally overtaking fear and hunger. She weighed almost nothing. Her body relaxed in sleep in a way it hadn't been while awake. He settled her carefully on the buggy seat and drove slowly back to the gas station, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. Inside the building, he explored more thoroughly, looking for any clues about how the child had come to be there. In what had once been Jacob's office, He found evidence of recent habitation, a sleeping bag, some empty food containers, and most significantly, a small pile of children's clothes neatly folded in a corner. Someone had been caring for this child, at least temporarily. It was then that he noticed the corner of an envelope protruding from beneath the sleeping bag. He pulled it free and felt his breath catch. The envelope was addressed to Abram Stoltzfus in careful handwriting. But it was the return address that made his hands shake. Rebecca Stoltzfus Miller, 1247 County Road 19, Sugar Creek, Ohio. Rebecca, Jacob's daughter. The child Abram had never known existed until this moment. Inside the envelope, he found a letter dated just 2 months ago. Dear Father, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I'm in trouble and don't know where else to turn. My husband left us 6 months ago, and the people he owed money to won't leave us alone. They've threatened Naomi, that's my daughter, your granddaughter. She just turned 5 last month. I'm bringing her to you because I don't know what else to do. The police can't help or won't help, I'm not sure which. I'll come back for her when it's safe, I promise. She's a good girl, quiet and smart. She likes stories and drawing, and she's never been away from me before, so she might be scared at first. I've left some of her things and what money I could spare. Please take care of her. Please don't let them find her. Your daughter, Rebecca P.S. She knows she has a grandfather, but not much else about family. I never told her about the Amish part. I didn't know how to explain. The letter fluttered from Abram's trembling fingers. This child, Naomi, was his great-niece, Jacob's granddaughter, the continuation of a family line he'd thought was lost forever. But where was Rebecca? Why hadn't she returned for her daughter? As if summoned by his thoughts, the child, Naomi, stirred from her sleeping place near the door. She looked around with momentary confusion before her gaze settled on Abram. Mama's coming back, she said with the certainty that only a child could muster in the face of evidence to the contrary. Abram folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. I'm sure she is, sweetheart, he said. Though his heart was already breaking for the conversation he might have to have with this innocent child about promises that couldn't be kept and mothers who sometimes couldn't come home. But for now, that conversation could wait. For now, he had a frightened, hungry child who needed care. And despite all his own troubles, Abram found that his heart, that broken heart he'd thought had nothing left to give, was already making room for one more soul to love. The ride back to Abram's farm stretched through the golden afternoon. Naomi curled against his side like a small animal seeking warmth. She'd awakened briefly when they'd left the gas station, her eyes wide with alarm until she recognized his face. Now she dozed fitfully, her breathing soft and regular, one small hand still gripping her handmade doll. Abram's mind raced with the implications of Rebecca's letter. His brother Jacob had not only left the Amish community, but had married, had a daughter, and become a grandfather, all without Abram ever knowing. 37 years of silence, and now this child was the only remaining thread connecting their fractured family. The familiar sight of his own farm appeared around the bend, the weathered barn with its sagging roof, the modest farmhouse where 4 generations of Stoltzfus men had raised their families, the pasture where his small herd of dairy cows grazed in the lengthening shadows. It looked smaller somehow, seen through the lens of his new responsibility. Mrs. Yoder from the neighboring farm was hanging laundry in her backyard, and she paused in her work to wave. Her curious gaze lingered on the small figure beside him, and Abram knew that by tomorrow morning, word would have spread through the community that Abram Stoltzfus had returned from his brother's property with an English child. The questions would come soon enough. Naomi stirred as they pulled into the farmyard, sitting up and looking around with the cautious interest of someone trying to understand where they'd landed. The chickens scattered as Patience approached, their indignant squawking causing the child to press closer to Abram's side. "It's all right," he murmured. "They're just chickens. They make a lot of noise, but they're harmless." After unhitching Patience and settling her in the barn with feed and water, Abram turned to find Naomi standing in the middle of the farmyard, turning in a slow circle as she took in her surroundings. The setting sun painted everything in warm amber light. The vegetable garden with its neat rows of late autumn produce. The chicken coop with its wire fencing. The old oak tree where Abram's own children had once played. "Are you hungry again?" he asked gently. She shook her head, but continued to stare at everything with wide eyes. When a barn cat emerged from the shadows and approached with typical feline curiosity, Naomi dropped to her knees and extended a careful hand. The cat, an old Tom named Moses, who was usually suspicious of strangers, surprised Abram by rubbing against the child's palm and purring. "He likes you," Abram observed. "Moses doesn't usually warm up to people so quickly." "Mama said I'm good with animals," Naomi whispered. The first unprompted information she'd shared about herself. Inside the farmhouse, the evening light filtered through plain white curtains, illuminating the simple furniture and unadorned walls that defined Amish life. Naomi followed him through the rooms, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors. She paused in the doorway of what had once been his and Sarah's bedroom, her gaze fixed on the quilt that covered the narrow bed. "Pretty," she said softly, reaching out to touch the intricate pattern of blues and whites. "My wife Sarah made that," Abram said. His voice catching slightly on the name, he still struggled to speak aloud. She was very good with needle and thread. The child's fingers traced the careful stitches, and something in her expression reminded Abram powerfully of Sarah's concentrated look when she worked on her quilting. The resemblance was impossible, of course. Naomi had no blood connection to Sarah, but perhaps there was something universal in the way women, even very small ones, recognized and appreciated the handiwork of other women. In the kitchen, Abram heated leftover soup and sliced fresh bread, simple food that filled the small space with comforting aromas. Naomi ate more slowly this time, with better manners, though she still watched him carefully, as if afraid the meal might be taken away. After supper, he showed her to the spare bedroom upstairs, a small space that had been intended for grandchildren who had never come to stay. The room held a simple wooden bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out over the pasture. Sarah had sewn curtains for that window years ago, hopeful white cotton with tiny blue flowers. "This can be your room while you're here," Abram said, pulling back the quilt to reveal clean white sheets. Naomi climbed onto the bed fully clothed, clutching her doll. She looked impossibly small against the white pillows, her dark hair spreading around her thin face like spilled ink. "Will you tell me a story?" she asked, and something in her tone suggested this had been a bedtime ritual with her mother. Abram settled into the chair beside the bed, his mind reaching back to the stories his own mother had told him decades ago. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a little sparrow who had lost her way." As he spoke, weaving a simple tale about the sparrow finding kindness among strangers, Naomi's eyes grew heavy. But even as sleep claimed her, she didn't release her grip on the doll. Whatever comfort that handmade toy provided, she wasn't ready to let go of it. Downstairs, Abram sat at his kitchen table and read Rebecca's letter again by lamplight. The words raised more questions than they answered. What kind of trouble had driven a mother to leave her 5-year-old daughter with a grandfather she'd never met? Who were these people her husband had owed money to, and how dangerous were they? He pulled out a piece of paper and began to write, "Dear Rebecca, I found your daughter Naomi at your father's gas station. She is safe now and staying with me at my farm. She is a sweet child, though frightened and very thin. I believe she has been alone for some time. I am your father's brother, which makes me Naomi's great-uncle. Your father and I had not spoken in many years, but family is family, and this child is family. She will be cared for and loved as long as she needs to stay. If you are able to write back, please let me know what has happened and when you might be able to return for her. If you cannot return, know that she will always have a home here. Your uncle, Abram Stoltzfus." He addressed the envelope to the return address from Rebecca's letter, though he had no way of knowing if she was still there or even still alive. The thought that this precious child might be orphaned sent a cold chill through him, but he pushed the fear aside. Tomorrow he would drive to town and post the letter. Tonight he would simply be grateful that Providence had led him to find Naomi before something worse had befallen her. From upstairs came the soft sound of a child's voice, talking quietly to her doll in the darkness. Abram listened, his heart both breaking and expanding at the same time. In one day, his life had been completely transformed. This morning, he'd been a lonely widower facing financial ruin. Tonight, he was responsible for a frightened little girl who had no one else in the world to depend on. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in months, Abram felt something that had been absent from his life since Sarah's death: purpose. This child needed him, and perhaps, though he was only beginning to understand it, he needed her just as much. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Abram prepared breakfast, moving quietly to avoid waking Naomi. He'd risen before dawn, as was his habit, milked the cows and tended to the animals, all while listening for sounds from upstairs. The house felt different with another presence in it. Less empty, but also charged with an unfamiliar tension. A soft creak on the stairs announced Naomi's arrival. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the same rumpled pink dress, her hair tangled from sleep, clutching her doll with one arm while rubbing her eyes with the other. She looked around the unfamiliar room with the cautious alertness of someone still unsure of her welcome. "Good morning, Naomi," Abram said gently, setting a plate of eggs and biscuits on the table. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded but didn't speak, sliding onto the wooden chair and regarding the food with the same wariness she'd shown the previous day. Only after Abram sat down with his own plate did she begin to eat, small, careful bites that suggested she was still afraid the meal might disappear. "We need to get you some proper clothes," Abram observed, noting how the pink dress hung loose on her small frame. "And perhaps a bath." The word bath seemed to alarm her. She shook her head vigorously, pressing back in her chair. "Not to worry," Abram said quickly. "We'll take it slow. Maybe just wash your hands and face for now." After breakfast, he showed her around the farm properly, pointing out the different animals and explaining their purposes. Naomi remained quiet but attentive, her eyes following his every movement. When they reached the chicken coop, she surprised him by knowing exactly how to scatter feed, holding her skirt to form a makeshift pouch for the grain, just as farm children had done for generations. "Your mama taught you that?" Abram asked. "Grandma Miller," Naomi said quietly. "Before she went to heaven." Another piece of the puzzle. Rebecca's mother, Jacob's wife, had apparently maintained some connection to farming traditions, even after leaving the Amish community. Abram found himself wondering what other aspects of their shared heritage had been passed down through the fractured family line. The sound of buggy wheels on gravel announced a visitor. Abram looked up to see Bishop Byler approaching, his black coat and serious expression suggesting this was more than a social call. The bishop was a fair man, but strict in his adherence to community standards, and Abram knew his decision to bring an English child home would require explanation. "Bishop Byler," Abram greeted, stepping forward to meet him. "Good morning, Abram." The bishop's gaze moved to Naomi, who had instinctively moved behind Abram's legs, peering around them with obvious uncertainty. "I heard you had returned from your brother's place with a child. This is Naomi," Abram said, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "She's Jacob's granddaughter. Her mother left her at the gas station and hasn't returned." The bishop's weathered face remained impassive, but Abram caught a flicker of something, concern perhaps, or understanding. "And her mother? Missing. Possibly in danger. I've written to try to reach her, but until I know more, the child needs care." Bishop Byler studied Naomi for a long moment. She stared back at him with those startling blue eyes, and Abram saw the moment when the bishop recognized the family resemblance. The Stoltzfus eyes were distinctive in their pale clarity. "She's English," the bishop said finally. "She's family," Abram replied firmly. The two men regarded each other in silence. years of mutual respect and community law hanging in the balance. Finally, Bishop Byler nodded slowly. The community will need to discuss this, Abram. An English child living among us raises questions. I understand. But, the bishop continued, his stern expression softening slightly, a child in need is a child in need. Until we know more about her circumstances, she may stay. However, if this arrangement becomes permanent, decisions will need to be made about her upbringing and education. After the bishop left, Abram found Naomi sitting on the front porch steps, her doll cradled in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her expression troubled. "Is he mad at me?" she asked in her small, careful voice. "No, sweetheart. He's not mad at anyone. He's just trying to understand how to help you best. Mama said some people don't like us because we're different." The innocent words hit Abram like a physical blow. What had this child already experienced that would make her mother feel the need to prepare her for rejection? "You're not different in any way that matters," he said, sitting beside her on the step. "You're a little girl who needs someone to take care of her. And that's exactly what I'm going to do." That afternoon, they drove to town in the buggy, Abram's letter to Rebecca carefully tucked in his coat pocket. Naomi sat close beside him, no longer trembling, but still alert to every new sight and sound. At the post office, she watched with fascination as he purchased stamps and carefully printed the address. "Is that to Mama?" she asked. "Yes, to tell her where you are and that you're safe." "When will she write back?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll watch for a letter every day." At Yoda's general store, Abram purchased fabric for new dresses, simple patterns in subdued colors that would be appropriate for both his community's standards and a little girl's needs. The elderly Mrs. Yoda, known throughout the district for her skilled sewing, examined Naomi with the shrewd eye of someone who had fitted clothing for 3 generations of local children. "Thin as a rail," she murmured, taking measurements with gentle efficiency. "But good bones. She'll fill out with proper feeding. I'll have 3 dresses ready by Saturday." On the way home, they stopped at the gas station. Abram needed to secure the building properly and collect any other belongings that might tell them more about Naomi's situation. Inside the dim structure, she led him directly to a corner he'd missed before, where a small suitcase sat hidden behind fallen debris. The suitcase contained treasures from a 5-year-old's perspective. More clothes, a few books with worn covers, a small wooden horse remarkably similar to the one Abram had carved, and at the bottom, wrapped carefully in a faded towel, a framed photograph. The photo showed a young woman with Naomi's dark hair and serious expression holding a baby. On the back, in careful handwriting, Rebecca and Naomi, age 6 months, but it was the small piece of paper tucked behind the photograph that made Abram's breath catch. A birth certificate listing Naomi's full name as Naomi Rose Stoltzfus Miller and confirming what he'd suspected. She was indeed Jacob's granddaughter, born 5 years and 3 months ago in Sugar Creek, Ohio. Looking at the official document, Abram felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement until someone else could be found to care for her. Naomi was a Stoltzfus, and Stoltzfus children belonged with family, no matter how complicated the circumstances. "That's Mama when I was little," Naomi said, studying the photograph with the concentration of someone trying to preserve every detail in memory. "She looks like you," Abram observed. "Same pretty eyes." She said, "I have Daddy's eyes." But he went away, another piece of the puzzle, and not a comforting one. How much had this child seen and understood about the troubles that had torn her family apart? As they drove home in the gathering dusk, Naomi fell asleep against his shoulder, the birth certificate safely tucked in his pocket next to Rebecca's letter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, questions from neighbors, decisions about schooling, the ongoing mystery of what had happened to Rebecca. But tonight, Abram felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the deep satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. 3 weeks passed, with the quiet rhythm of farm life gradually absorbing Naomi's presence. She had settled into routines with the adaptability of childhood, helping Abram with morning chores, feeding the chickens with careful precision, and sitting quietly beside him during evening meals. Yet beneath her growing comfort, Abram sensed an undercurrent of watchful waiting, as if she were holding herself ready for the next disruption to her small world. The new dresses from Mrs. Yoder had transformed her appearance. Simple blue and grey cotton that made her look less like a lost waif and more like the farm child she was becoming. Her hair, now clean and properly braided each morning, caught the autumn light as she moved through the farmyard. But it was her eyes that told the true story of her gradual healing, less fearful now, though still carrying shadows too deep for someone so young. The community had responded to her presence with the measured acceptance typical of people who valued tradition but understood necessity. Children from neighboring farms had begun to visit, drawn by curiosity and the universal appeal of someone new to play with. Naomi remained shy, but Abram had caught glimpses of her natural personality emerging, a quiet intelligence, a gentle way with animals, and a surprising sense of humor that surfaced when she felt truly safe. It was on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after he'd found her, that the letter arrived. Abram recognized the return address immediately, though the handwriting was different, shakier, more desperate than Rebecca's careful script. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Naomi, watching from across the kitchen table with the heightened awareness children develop when they sense adult anxiety. Dear Uncle Abram, this is Rebecca's friend Martha writing because Rebecca can't write herself right now. She's in the hospital in Columbus after what happened, but she's going to be okay. The doctors say she'll recover, but it will take time. The men her husband owed money to found where she was staying, and they hurt her pretty bad. She kept asking about Naomi even when she could barely talk. She wants you to know she didn't abandon her baby. She was trying to lead the bad men away from the gas station so they wouldn't find her. Rebecca says to tell you that Naomi's real name is Naomi Rose Stoltzfus Miller, and her daddy was Rebecca's husband, Tom Miller, who got mixed up with gambling and bad people. He left them 6 months ago and nobody knows where he went. Rebecca says Naomi doesn't remember much about him, which is probably for the best. She also says to tell you that Naomi knows some Pennsylvania Dutch because Rebecca's mother taught her before she died. Rebecca wanted her to know something about where she came from, even though they weren't living the plain life anymore. Rebecca will write herself when she's better. She says thank you for taking care of her baby, and she hopes someday she can come get her when it's safe. Right now, the police say those men are still looking for Tom Miller and anyone connected to him. I'm sorry this letter isn't better news. Rebecca cries every time she talks about Naomi, but she says knowing she's with family is the only thing keeping her going. Please take good care of that little girl. She's been through more than any child should have to bear. Sincerely, Martha Hendricks. Abram read the letter twice, his heart heavy with the weight of what it revealed. Naomi sat quietly, watching his face, and he realized she could read his expressions far better than most adults could read actual words. Is it about Mama? She asked in her small, careful voice. Abram folded the letter and looked into those familiar blue eyes, eyes that had already seen too much of the world's harsh realities. Your Mama is sick right now, but she's getting better. She wanted me to tell you that she loves you very much, and she's glad you're here with me. When is she coming to get me? The question he'd been dreading. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that the world can be dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with her? That sometimes mothers can't come home even when they desperately want to? I don't know, sweetheart. But she wants you to stay here with me until it's safe for her to come. Naomi considered this with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. Are the bad men going to come here? No, Abram said firmly. They don't know about this place, and I won't let anyone hurt you. That afternoon, as Naomi played quietly in the farmyard with a family of barn kittens, Abram found himself studying her with new eyes. Martha's letter had confirmed what he'd suspected. This child had been exposed to violence and fear before she'd ever arrived at the gas station. The way she startled at sudden noises, her tendency to hoard food even when assured there would always be more, the nightmares that sometimes woke her in the early morning hours, all signs of a little girl who had learned too young that the world wasn't always safe. But he also saw resilience in her, the same stubborn strength that ran through Stoltzfus' blood. She'd survived being abandoned, had found ways to keep herself alive until he'd found her, and was now adapting to a completely different way of life with remarkable grace. Whatever else Tom Miller had brought into their lives, he'd given Rebecca a daughter with the backbone to survive it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. 2 riders were coming up the lane. Englishmen in dark clothing who sat their horses with the easy confidence of people accustomed to being obeyed. Abram felt a chill of recognition, though he'd never seen these particular men before. There was something in their bearing, their deliberate approach, that spoke of trouble. Naomi looked up from her play, saw the riders, and immediately dropped the kitten she'd been holding. Without a word, she ran to Abram's side, pressing against his legs with the instinctive fear of someone who had learned to associate strange men with danger. The riders pulled up at the farmyard gate, their eyes scanning the property with professional thoroughness. The older of the two, a man in his 50s with graying hair and cold eyes, spoke first. "Afternoon. We're looking for information about a little girl named Naomi Miller. We understand she might be staying in this area." Abram's arm tightened protectively around Naomi's shoulders. "And you are?" "Private investigators," the younger man said, though something in his tone suggested that wasn't the complete truth. "The child's father is looking for her, wants to make sure she's safe." "Her father," Abram repeated, remembering Martha's letter about Tom Miller disappearing 6 months ago. "And where has he been these past months, while his daughter was living abandoned in a gas station?" The 2 men exchanged glances. "Family matters can be complicated," the older one said smoothly. "The point is, he's ready to take responsibility for her now. We just need to know where she is." Naomi pressed closer to Abram, her small body trembling. Whether she recognized these specific men or simply understood the threat they represented, her fear was unmistakable. "I'm sorry," Abram said with the quiet dignity that had served him well in 69 years of life. "I don't have any information that would help you." The younger man's expression hardened. "Mr. Stoltzfus, yes, we know who you are. We're not going away until we find that child. Her father has rights, and he's determined to exercise them. Then I suggest he contact the proper authorities," Abram replied calmly. "Good day, gentlemen." As the riders turned to leave, the older man looked back over his shoulder. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Stoltzfus, one way or another." Only after they disappeared down the lane did Abram allow himself to fully feel the fear that had been building in his chest. These weren't investigators working for Tom Miller. These were the dangerous men Martha's letter had warned about. And somehow they'd tracked Naomi to his farm. The child was no longer just his responsibility. She was now his to protect. And the stakes had just become a matter of life and death. That evening, after Naomi had fallen asleep, Abram sat at his kitchen table, staring at the telephone he'd installed 5 years ago when Sarah's health had begun failing. He'd resisted the technology for decades, viewing it as an unnecessary intrusion of the English world into his plain life. Now he was grateful for its presence as he dialed the number Bishop Byler had given him for emergencies. The conversation was brief but illuminating. The bishop had already heard about the strangers asking questions in town, had already spoken with the sheriff about increased patrols in the area. More troubling, he'd learned from contacts in the English community that similar men had been spotted in 3 neighboring counties, all asking about a 5-year-old girl with dark hair and blue eyes. "This is beyond what our community can handle alone." "Abram," the bishop said, his usual stern demeanor softened by genuine concern. "These men, whoever they are, they're not bound by our ways of dealing with conflict. What are you suggesting?" "That you consider involving the English authorities fully. Not just the local sheriff, but perhaps the state police, even federal agents, if this involves crossing state lines. That child safety may depend on resources we simply don't have. After ending the call, Abram climbed the stairs to check on Naomi. She lay curled in her narrow bed, her handmade doll clutched against her chest, her breathing deep and even. But even in sleep, her small face carried traces of tension, and twice he saw her flinch at sounds only she could hear in whatever dreams occupied her rest. He spent the night sitting in the kitchen, watching the lane through the window. Martha's letter spread before him alongside Naomi's birth certificate and Rebecca's original plea for help. The documents told a story of a family torn apart by one man's poor choices and another's desperate attempts to protect what remained. Dawn brought no resolution, only the familiar rhythm of farm chores that provided structure in an increasingly uncertain world. Naomi appeared for breakfast pale but composed, and Abram realized she'd probably slept as little as he had. Children, he'd learned over the years, often sensed danger more acutely than adults, their survival instincts less clouded by rationalization and false comfort. "Uncle Abram," she said quietly as she picked at her eggs, "are those men going to take me away?" The directness of the question, and her use of Uncle Abram for the first time, nearly undid him. "I won't let that happen, sweetheart. Mama used to say that too. But sometimes things happen anyway." The wisdom in those words, spoken by someone who hadn't yet reached her 6th birthday, broke his heart and strengthened his resolve in equal measure. This child had learned too young that promises weren't always kept, that adults couldn't always protect the people they loved. He couldn't give her false assurances, but he could give her truth. "You're right," he said, sitting across from her at the small table. "Sometimes things happen that we can't control. But I want you to know that whatever happens, I will fight to keep you safe. And if for some reason I can't keep you with me, I will make sure you go to people who will love you and take care of you." She studied his face with those disconcerting blue eyes. "Promise?" "I promise." The morning brought an unexpected visitor, Sheriff Morrison, a man Abram had known peripherally for years, but had never had occasion to speak with at length. Morrison was younger than Abram, probably in his late 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his career dealing with the darker aspects of human nature. "Mr. Stoltzfus," Morrison said, declining the offer of coffee, but accepting a chair at the kitchen table. "I understand you've had some concerning visitors. 2 men, claiming to be private investigators, looking for Naomi. Did they show you any identification?" "They did not." Abram glanced toward the stairs, where Naomi was presumably playing in her room, though he suspected she was actually listening to every word of the conversation below. Morrison pulled out a small notebook. "Can you describe them?" After Abram provided detailed descriptions, the sheriff nodded grimly. "We've had reports of similar men in 3 counties. They're not private investigators, at least not legitimate ones. We think they're connected to a gambling operation out of Cincinnati, the same one that's been linked to several cases of intimidation and violence in Ohio. The child's mother is in the hospital because of these people. So we understand. Mr. Stoltzfus, I'm going to be direct with you. That little girl upstairs is in real danger. These aren't people who give up easily, and they have resources that allow them to keep looking until they find what they want." Abram felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. "What do you suggest?" "Several options. We can place you both in protective custody." "No." The word came out more sharply than Abram had intended. "This is our home. She's been moved around enough. Then we increase security here. I can arrange for regular patrols, maybe even place a deputy on the property. But Mr. Stoltzfus, if they decide to escalate, our resources are limited. These people have shown they're willing to use violence." From upstairs came the sound of small footsteps, and moments later Naomi appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked from Abram to the sheriff with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to read adult moods for survival. "This is Sheriff Morrison," Abram said gently. He's here to help keep us safe. Morrison's expression softened as he looked at the child. Hello, Naomi. I know this is scary, but we're going to do everything we can to protect you. Are you going to arrest the bad men? We're going to try. But first we have to find them, and that takes time. After Morrison left, promising increased patrols and a direct phone line for emergencies, Abram found himself struggling with a decision he'd hoped never to face. In his coat pocket, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was something he hadn't touched in 40 years, his father's Colt .45, the gun Jacob had left behind when he'd abandoned the farm and the Amish life. Amish beliefs forbade violence, even in self-defense. But those beliefs had been formed in a different world, among people who shared common values about the sanctity of life and the importance of community. The men hunting Naomi operated by different rules entirely, and Abram found himself wondering if his commitment to non-violence might ultimately cost an innocent child her life. That afternoon, as Naomi played quietly in the front parlor, Abram walked to the barn and retrieved the gun from its hiding place behind loose boards in the feed room. The metal was cold in his hands, heavier than he remembered, but familiar in the way that muscle memory never quite forgets. He'd learned to shoot as a young man. Before his baptism, before his full commitment to the plain life, his father had insisted, claiming it was necessary for protecting livestock from predators. Sometimes, his father had said, the world requires us to choose between our ideals and our responsibilities. Standing in the dim barn, Abram understood for the first time what his father had meant. His ideals told him that violence was never the answer, that God would provide protection for the innocent. His responsibilities told him that sometimes God's protection came through the hands of those willing to act when action was necessary. The gun felt like a betrayal of everything he'd believed for 69 years. It also felt like the only thing standing between Naomi and the kind of men who hurt children to collect debts. As he cleaned and loaded the weapon with hands that remembered motions from 40 years past, Abram prayed for forgiveness, not for what he might have to do, but for the part of him that was already prepared to do it, outside. Naomi's laughter drifted through the afternoon air as she played with the barn cats, innocent of the decision her safety had forced him to make. That laughter, he realized, was worth more than any belief, any tradition, any principle he'd ever held dear. 2 days of uneasy quiet had passed when the second letter arrived. This time Abram recognized the handwriting immediately, Rebecca's careful script, though shakier than before. He opened it with trembling fingers while Naomi fed the chickens in the yard, her small figure moving with the unconscious grace of someone who had found her place in the rhythm of farm life. Dear Uncle Abram, I can write now, though my hands still shake and the words don't always come easy. Martha told you what happened about the men who found me. What she didn't tell you, what I couldn't let her put in a letter that might fall into the wrong hands, is the truth about why they're really looking for Naomi. It's not about Tom's gambling debts. It's about what Tom stole before he disappeared. My husband was deeper into their organization than I knew. He wasn't just gambling, he was working for them, helping them move money and keep books. When he decided to run, he took something with him. Not money, but something worth more than money to people like that. Information, names, dates, amounts, everything that could put their operation out of business and put them in prison for the rest of their lives. The FBI has been trying to penetrate this organization for 3 years. Tom's information could be the key to destroying them completely. That's why they're so desperate to find him, and why they think Naomi might know where he is or what he did with what he took. Uncle Abram, I have to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear. Tom came to see us about a month before I left Naomi at the gas station. He was thin and scared and kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to appear at any moment. He told me he'd hidden something important, something that would either save us all or get us all killed, depending on who found it first. He said he left it somewhere safe, somewhere connected to our family history, Somewhere only someone with Stoltzfus blood would think to look. I thought he was talking crazy, the way he'd been talking for months, but now I think he was trying to tell me something specific. Uncle Abram, I think Tom hid whatever he took at my father's gas station. I think that's why he told me to take Naomi there if anything happened to me. Not just to keep her safe, but because he knew eventually someone from the family would come to claim the property. And when they did, they'd find what he left behind. I know this sounds impossible, but you have to believe me. These men aren't just dangerous, they're desperate. They know Tom is probably dead by now. He had a heart condition and no medicine, but they think his information is still out there somewhere. They think Naomi might have seen where he put it, or that someone in the family might know something. You have to search that gas station again. Uncle Abram, not just for old belongings or clues about Naomi's past, but for whatever Tom hid there. If you can find it and get it to the FBI, these men will finally leave us alone. But if they find it first, or if they think we're keeping it from them, they'll never stop hunting us. I'm getting better, but the doctors say it will be weeks before I can travel. Even then, I don't know if it will ever be safe for me to come for Naomi. These people have long memories and longer reach than I ever imagined. Take care of my baby. Uncle Abram, she's all I have left in this world. And knowing she's with family is the only thing keeping me alive right now. Your niece, Rebecca P.S. Tom used to say that the most important things are always hidden in plain sight. He was always playing word games and puzzles. Maybe that's a clue to where he put whatever he took. Abram read the letter 3 times, his mind reeling with the implications. Tom Miller hadn't just been a gambler who'd gotten in over his head. He'd been part of the criminal organization, had stolen from them, and had apparently hidden evidence that could destroy them. And he'd hidden it at Jacob's gas station, the same place where Naomi had been left. The irony was staggering. Jacob had spent 37 years running from his Amish heritage, only to have his property become the center of a web that connected his granddaughter, his brother, and the dangerous men who now threatened them all. That afternoon, while Naomi napped upstairs, Abram drove back to the gas station with new purpose. This time, he wasn't looking for personal belongings or sentimental keepsakes. He was searching for something that might be small enough to hide, but valuable enough to kill for. The abandoned building felt different now that he understood its true significance. What had seemed like random decay and neglect now looked potentially deliberate. Had Tom Miller arranged the chaos to conceal whatever he'd hidden? Or had years of abandonment simply provided the perfect camouflage? Abram began his search systematically, starting with the obvious places, behind loose boards, inside old containers, under debris. He found nothing but dust and the accumulated detritus of years. But Rebecca's postscript nagged at him. The most important things are always hidden in plain sight. What would be in plain sight at a gas station? What would seem so ordinary that no one would think to examine it closely? His gaze fell on the old Sunoco sign, its faded paint and obvious age making it a perfect hiding place. Using tools from his buggy, he carefully pried at the sign's mounting brackets. Behind the metal backing, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and tape, he found a small package. Inside was a micro-cassette tape and a handwritten note in Tom Miller's distinctive scrawl, "For Naomi's future. The truth about Vincent Carbone and his friends. Give this to Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Cincinnati. She'll know what to do with it." Abram stared at the tape, understanding that he held in his hands either salvation or a death sentence. This tiny device contained information that could free his family from the shadow of dangerous men. But possessing it also made him a target for those same men. The sound of approaching vehicles made his blood freeze. 3 black cars were pulling into the gas station lot, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had done this before. Abram pocketed the tape and note, his mind racing through possibilities. The cars had blocked his only exit. There was no way to reach his buggy without being seen. 6 men emerged from the vehicles, the same 2 he'd encountered at his farm, plus 4 others. Their leader, the older man with grey hair and cold eyes, approached the building with casual confidence. "Mr. Stoltzfus," he called out. "We know you're in there. We also know you've found what we're looking for. This can go easy or hard, your choice." Abram's hand moved instinctively to his coat pocket, where his father's gun rested next to Tom Miller's tape. Two items that represented the collision of his old life with circumstances he'd never imagined facing. "We're not unreasonable people," the man continued, stepping closer to the building's entrance. "We just want what Tom Miller stole from us. Give it back, and everyone walks away happy. Keep it, and things get unpleasant for everyone, including that little girl back at your farm." The threat against Naomi crystallized Abram's resolve. These men had tracked him here, which meant they'd been watching his movements, learning his routines. They knew about Naomi, knew where she was, and weren't above threatening a child to get what they wanted. "You have 10 seconds to come out with our property," the man said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "After that, we come in and tear that building apart, and then we pay a visit to your farm." Abram closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision that would define the rest of his life. He could surrender the tape and hope these men kept their word about leaving them alone. Or he could fight for the chance to get the evidence to the FBI and end this threat permanently. But fighting meant abandoning the principles that had guided him for 69 years. It meant choosing violence over faith, action over submission to God's will. From his pocket, he pulled out his father's gun, checking the chamber with movements his hands remembered despite 4 decades of disuse. The metal felt cold and foreign, yet necessary in a way that made his heart ache. 5 seconds, old man. Abram stepped to the window, the tape secured in his inner pocket, the gun steady in his hands. Through the cracked glass, he could see the men positioning themselves around the building, professional and patient, and utterly without mercy. For Naomi, he thought, for the chance that she might grow up free from the shadows that had destroyed her family. The first shot shattered the morning quiet, and with it, the last of Abram Stoltzfus's 40-year commitment to absolute non-violence. The gunshot echoed across the empty countryside like thunder, shattering not just the morning quiet, but the last vestiges of the peaceful world Abram had known. He'd aimed high, sending the bullet through the gas station's roof, a warning shot rather than an attempt to harm, though he doubted the men outside would appreciate the distinction. "He's armed," one of them shouted, and suddenly the casual confidence in their voices evaporated, replaced by the sharp urgency of professionals adapting to an unexpected threat. Abram pressed himself against the interior wall, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that made him dizzy. The gun felt impossibly heavy in his hands, its metal surface slick with perspiration from palms that hadn't gripped a weapon in 4 decades. Through cracks in the boarded windows, he could see the men taking cover behind their vehicles, speaking in low, urgent tones he couldn't quite hear. The tape in his inner pocket seemed to burn against his chest, such a small thing to have sparked such violence, yet containing information that could apparently topple an entire criminal enterprise. Tom Miller's final gamble, hidden in plain sight at his father-in-law's abandoned dream. Now the key to either salvation or destruction for everyone Abram loved. His mind raced through possibilities, each more grim than the last. 6 armed men against 1 elderly Amish farmer with a 40-year-old pistol and maybe 12 bullets. The odds were hopeless, but the stakes, Naomi's safety, Rebecca's life, the chance to finally end this nightmare, demanded that he try. "Mr. Stoltzfus," the leader's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "You're only making this harder on yourself. And on that little girl." The mention of Naomi sent ice through Abram's veins. How much did they know about his daily routines? Had they been watching long enough to know she was alone at the farm right now, napping in her small bedroom under Sarah's quilt, trusting that he would return to keep her safe? Movement at the building's rear entrance caught his attention. 2 men working their way around to flank him. The gas station's layout, which he'd explored thoroughly during his searches, suddenly became tactical terrain. The service bay, with its oil-stained floor and empty equipment bays, offered some cover, but the building's numerous windows and doors made it nearly impossible to defend for any length of time. He needed help, needed to contact Sheriff Morrison, needed to get word to the FBI agent Tom Miller had mentioned in his note. But the phone in his buggy might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do him now. A new voice joined the conversation outside, younger, more volatile. "This is taking too long, Vincent. The old man's just going to keep playing games. Let me go in there and—" "Shut up, Danny." The leader's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "We do this clean and quiet. The last thing we need is local cops showing up because some farmer got himself shot. Vincent Carbone, the name from Tom Miller's note. The man whose criminal organization the FBI had been trying to penetrate for 3 years. Abram was looking at the head of the snake, the person responsible for Rebecca's injuries, for Naomi's terror, for the destruction of a family he was only beginning to know. The knowledge should have filled him with righteous anger, but instead he felt only a deep, abiding sadness. This was what the English world had done to his family. Torn them apart with violence and greed, forced children to grow up afraid, made mothers choose between their own safety and their children's lives. A scraping sound from the building's south wall announced another flanking attempt. Abram moved carefully through the shadowy interior, using his knowledge of the building's layout to stay ahead of his pursuers. In the small office where he'd found Rebecca's first letter, he discovered something he'd missed during his earlier searches: a back door, partially hidden behind fallen shelving. The door was locked, but the wood around the frame had rotted with age and moisture. A few careful kicks freed it from its hinges, creating an escape route the men outside hadn't accounted for. But escape to where? His buggy was blocked. He was miles from the nearest neighbor, and even if he could reach help, it might arrive too late to save Naomi. Through the broken door, Abram could see open fields stretching toward a line of trees, perhaps a quarter-mile away. Beyond those trees lay the Kaufman farm, where old Isaac Kaufman maintained one of the few telephones in the immediate area. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had, moving as quietly as possible. He slipped through the door and began making his way toward the tree line, staying low and using the building to screen his movement from the men positioned at the front. The micro-cassette tape bounced against his chest with each step, a constant reminder of what he carried and why this desperate gamble mattered. He'd covered perhaps 50 yards when the shout went up behind him. "There, he's running for the woods." The crack of rifle fire split the morning air, bullets whining overhead with the distinctive sound of rounds that had come uncomfortably close. Abram ran harder than he had in decades, his aging body protesting every jarring step, his lungs burning with the effort. More shots, closer this time. Dirt exploded near his feet as he reached the first line of trees, the woodland closing around him like a protective embrace. Behind him, he could hear the men shouting orders, organizing pursuit, their casual confidence replaced by the urgency of prey that had slipped the trap. The trees were oak and maple mostly, their autumn canopy providing some concealment but little real cover. Abram pressed deeper into the woods, following deer paths he remembered from childhood explorations. His knowledge of the local terrain, the only advantage he possessed against younger, better armed pursuers. 5 minutes of hard running brought him to Isaac Kaufman's fence line. The elderly farmer was in his garden, harvesting late potatoes with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did. He looked up in surprise as Abram burst from the tree line, his expression shifting quickly from confusion to alarm as he took in the gun, the torn clothing, the obvious desperation. "Abram, what's Isaac, I need your telephone now. There are armed men after me, and they're threatening my great-niece." Isaac Kaufman was 73 years old and had lived through enough of life's complications to recognize genuine crisis when he saw it. Without another word, he led Abram to his house and pointed toward the kitchen phone. Abram's hands shook as he dialed Sheriff Morrison's direct number. praying the man would answer, praying he wasn't too late to prevent disaster. Morrison, Sheriff, this is Abram Stoltzfus. I'm at Isaac Kaufman's farm and I need help immediately. The men who were looking for Naomi, they found me at the gas station. There are 6 of them armed and they're planning to go to my farm next. Are you hurt? No, but they shot at me. Sheriff, I found what they were looking for, evidence that could destroy their organization. I need to get it to the FBI, but first, I need to make sure Naomi is safe. I'm 15 minutes out from your location. Can you hold out that long? Through Isaac's kitchen window, Abram could see movement at the edge of the woods, dark figures working their way through the trees with professional patience. I don't think so. They're already here. Then get to the root cellar, Isaac said quietly, having listened to enough of the conversation to understand the situation. Sarah and I hid there during the tornado of '78. They'll never find you. As they descended into the underground shelter, Abram realized he was asking Isaac to risk his own life for a problem that wasn't his making. Isaac, I'm sorry to bring this to your door. Naomi is family now, the old farmer said simply. Family protects family. Besides, at my age, a little excitement might do me good. The root cellar was dark and cramped, but solidly built, its stone walls providing better protection than anything the gas station had offered. From above came the sounds of the house being searched, rough voices slamming doors, furniture being overturned. The men were being thorough but not destructive, still trying to maintain some semblance of legitimacy. They're not here, one of the voices said eventually. But the old man was definitely in this house. Kitchen phone is still warm. Then they can't be far, Carbone's voice replied. Danny, take 2 men and check the outbuildings. Marco, you and Pete head back to the cars. If they called for help, we need to be ready to move fast. What about the farm? The kid? We stick to the plan. If Stoltzfus wants to play hero, fine. But that little girl is our leverage, and leverage only works if people believe you'll use it. The words sent terror through Abram's heart. They were still planning to go after Naomi, still willing to threaten a child to get what they wanted. The tape in his pocket might be evidence enough to convict them all, but it wouldn't matter if they hurt her first. Above them, the house fell silent as the men moved their search outside. Isaac checked his pocket watch by the dim light filtering through a crack in the cellar door. Sheriff should be here soon, he whispered, but soon might not be soon enough. Naomi was alone at the farm, napping peacefully, trusting that the world was safe because Uncle Abram had promised to protect her. The same Uncle Abram, who was now hiding in a root cellar while armed criminals planned to use her as bait. For the first time in his adult life, Abram found himself praying not for patience or acceptance of God's will, but for the strength to do whatever violence might be necessary to keep a 5-year-old girl safe from men who viewed her as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. The sound of approaching sirens broke the morning stillness. But even as relief flooded through him, Abram knew the real confrontation was still to come. These men had crossed too many lines to simply surrender, and they'd made it clear that Naomi remained their primary target. The climax he'd been dreading was about to begin, and everything, his principles, his faith, his family's future, hung in the balance. Sheriff Morrison arrived with 3 deputies and a sense of urgency that made Abram's heart race even faster. The lawmen deployed around Isaac's property with practiced efficiency, but their quarry had already vanished. 6 men and 3 black cars, gone as if they'd never existed. They're professionals, Morrison said grimly, holstering his weapon after checking the abandoned house. They knew we were coming and cleared out before we could surround them. Abram emerged from the root cellar with Isaac, his legs shaky from the adrenaline crash. Sheriff, they said they were going to my farm next. Naomi already sent 2 units there, Morrison interrupted. But Abram, I need to see what you found at that gas station. If it's what I think it is, we're dealing with something way beyond local law enforcement. With trembling hands, Abram produced the microcassette tape and Tom Miller's note. Morrison examined both items with the careful attention of someone who understood their potential significance. Vincent Carbone, Morrison read aloud. Jesus, no wonder they're so desperate. He looked up at Abram with newfound respect and concern. This tape could put half of Cincinnati's organized crime behind bars. It also makes you and your niece the most dangerous people in 3 states, as far as they're concerned. What do? We get you both somewhere safe, and we get this evidence to the FBI as fast as possible. Morrison was already on his radio, calling for federal backup, requesting witness protection protocols, setting in motion machinery that Abram barely understood but knew was their only hope. 20 minutes later, they were racing toward Abram's farm in Morrison's patrol car, the tape secured in an evidence bag, 2 federal agents already en route from Cincinnati. Abram pressed his face to the window, watching familiar countryside blur past, praying they weren't too late. The farm looked peaceful as they approached, almost mockingly normal in the afternoon sunlight. Patients grazed contentedly in the pasture. The chickens pecked at insects in the farmyard, and smoke rose from the chimney where Abram had banked the fire that morning. But 2 sheriff's deputies flanked the house with drawn weapons, their presence a stark reminder that this tranquil scene masked deadly danger. "All quiet," Deputy Chen reported as they pulled into the farmyard. "We did a perimeter check, no signs of intrusion. The child appears to be inside, probably still asleep." Relief flooded through Abram as he rushed toward the house, Morrison close behind. But his relief turned to ice-cold terror as he pushed open the front door and called out, "Naomi? Naomi, sweetheart!" Silence. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs. The spare bedroom door stood open, Sarah's quilt folded neatly at the foot of the narrow bed. The room was empty. "She's not here," he called down to Morrison, his voice cracking with the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. The sheriff appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his expression grim. "Are you sure this is where she'd be?" "She always naps in the afternoon, always." Abram searched the room desperately, looking for signs of struggle, clues about what had happened. That's when he noticed it, a single piece of paper on the pillow where Naomi's head should have been resting. The note was written in the same careful handwriting he'd seen on Tom Miller's message, but the paper was different, torn from a child's coloring book, with crayon marks around the edges. "Uncle Abram, we have the girl. She came with us willingly when we told her you were hurt and needed her. Bring the tape to the old Miller place at sunset. Come alone. Any sign of police and the child disappears permanently. You have one chance to save her. Don't waste it, OVC." The paper fluttered from Abram's fingers as the full horror of the situation crashed over him. They had Naomi. These ruthless men who had beaten Rebecca unconscious, who had shot at him without hesitation, now held a 5-year-old girl who trusted everyone because her world had taught her that adults were supposed to protect children, not hurt them. "The bastards grabbed her while we were chasing them through the woods," Morrison said, having read the note over Abram's shoulder. Probably had someone watching the house the whole time. "She went with them willingly," Abram whispered, his voice hollow with grief and guilt. "She trusted them because they said I was hurt. This isn't your fault, isn't it?" Abram turned to face the sheriff, his eyes blazing with an anger deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. "I brought this danger to her. I could have given them the tape immediately, could have what? Trusted the word of men who beat women and kidnap children. Abram, that tape is the only thing keeping both of you alive right now. The moment they get it, you and Naomi become loose ends." The logic was sound, but it did nothing to ease the crushing weight of responsibility. Somewhere out there, probably terrified and confused, was a little girl who had already endured more trauma than most adults. She was depending on him to save her, just as her mother had depended on him to keep her safe, and he had failed them both. "The federal agents will be here in an hour," Morrison continued. "We can set up a tactical response, surround the gas station." "No!" The word came out with such finality that Morrison stopped mid-sentence. "The note says no police, and I believe they mean it. I won't risk Naomi's life on the assumption that they're bluffing. You can't seriously be thinking of going in there alone." Abram looked out the bedroom window toward the setting sun. calculating how much time he had before the deadline. "Sheriff, I'm 69 years old. I've lived a full life, had a good marriage, seen more sunrises than most men get to enjoy. But that little girl, she hasn't had her chance yet. It's suicide, maybe, but it's also the only chance she has." Abram straightened, his shoulders with the dignity that had carried him through nearly 7 decades of life's challenges. "I'm going to that gas station, and I'm going to trade myself for Naomi. The tape, too, if that's what it takes. And if they kill you both anyway?" Abram was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the handmade doll sitting on Naomi's pillow, the one comfort she'd left behind in her rush to help her supposedly injured uncle. Then at least she won't die alone. The sun hung low on the horizon as Abram approached the gas station for what he knew would be the last time. He'd come alone, as demanded, though he knew Sheriff Morrison and the federal agents were positioned at strategic points around the property, ready to intervene if negotiations broke down. The micro-cassette tape rested in his shirt pocket right next to his heart, while his father's gun pressed against his ribs from its shoulder holster. 3 black cars sat in the station lot exactly as they had that morning, but now their presence felt like a funeral procession. The men who emerged as he approached moved with the casual confidence of people who believed they held all the advantages. Vincent Carbone stepped forward, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Stoltzfus, punctual as always. Where is she?" "Safe, scared, but safe. She keeps asking for her Uncle Abram and wondering when you're coming to get her." Carbone's tone carried mock sympathy. "Sweet kid. Shame she got mixed up in her grandfather's poor choices." Abram's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I brought what you want. Let me see her, and we can make the trade." Carbone nodded to one of his men, who disappeared into the gas station. Moments later, he emerged leading Naomi by the hand. She looked smaller than ever, her new blue dress torn at the sleeve, her face streaked with tears. But when she saw Abram, her entire expression transformed. Uncle Abram. She tried to run to him, but the man's grip on her hand held her back. "They said you were hurt, but you look okay. Can we go home now?" The innocent trust in her voice nearly broke his resolve. She still believed that adults would keep their promises, that good people always won in the end, that her uncle could fix anything. The knowledge that he was about to shatter that faith forever felt like a physical weight on his chest. "Soon, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle despite the circumstances. "I just need to give these men something first." "The tape," Carbone said, extending his hand. "Nice and slow." Abram reached into his shirt pocket, his fingers closing around the small cassette that had caused so much destruction. Such a tiny thing to have torn apart so many lives. As he pulled it out, time seemed to slow, each second stretching like taffy. This was the moment of decision. He could hand over the tape and hope these men kept their word about releasing Naomi, or he could gamble everything on a desperate plan that would either save them both or get them both killed. "You know," Abram said conversationally, holding the tape but not yet offering it, "I've been thinking about something Tom Miller wrote in his note. He said the most important things are always hidden in plain sight." Carbone's eyes narrowed. "Your point? This isn't the only copy." The lie came easily, born from desperation and the need to keep them talking long enough for his real plan to work. "Tom was too smart to put all his eggs in one basket. If something happens to me or the child, other copies will find their way to the FBI. You're bluffing." "Am I?" Abram smiled with more confidence than he felt. "Tom spent 3 years gathering this information. You really think he'd leave only one copy hidden in a place his enemies might eventually search?" The uncertainty that flickered across Carbone's face told Abram his gamble was working. These men had survived by being paranoid, by assuming their enemies were as cunning as they were. The possibility that Tom Miller had outsmarted them, even in death, would eat at them. "Where are the other copies?" Carbone demanded. "Safe, along with instructions for their release if anything happens to us." Abram took a step forward, the tape still in his hand. "But I'm a reasonable man. You let the child go and I'll tell you where to find them. And why would I trust the word of someone who just admitted to lying about having only one copy? Because, Abram said quietly, what choice do you have? The standoff stretched for long seconds, 6 armed men against one elderly farmer and a frightened child. Then Carbone's expression shifted, the cold calculation giving way to something darker. You know what? You're right. I don't have a choice. He drew his pistol with fluid grace, the barrel tracking toward Naomi with deadly precision. But neither do you. The tape or the kid dies right here, right now. The sight of a gun pointed at Naomi shattered the last of Abram's restraint. With a roar of rage that surprised everyone present, he threw the cassette tape as hard as he could toward the gas station's boarded windows and drew his father's gun in the same motion. Time exploded into chaos. The tape shattered against the building, pieces of plastic and magnetic ribbons scattering like confetti. Carbone swung his weapon toward Abram, but the old farmer was already moving, placing himself between the gunman and Naomi with the fierce determination of someone who had finally found something worth dying for. The first shot took Abram in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. The second shot came from Sheriff Morrison's rifle, fired from concealment at the tree line, and Vincent Carbone crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain and rage. Then the world erupted in gunfire as federal agents and sheriff's deputies emerged from positions around the property, their voices shouting commands that were lost in the thunder of weapons. Abram grabbed Naomi and pulled her behind the shelter of his buggy as bullets whined overhead, her small body trembling against his chest. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "It's almost over now." And for the first time in weeks, he actually believed it might be true. 3 months later, Abram sat on his front porch, watching Naomi chase chickens in the farmyard, her laughter floating across the winter air like music. His left arm was still stiff from the shoulder wound, but the physical pain had long since given way to the deeper satisfaction of watching a child learn to be a child again. The federal investigation had been swift and thorough. The shattered cassette tape had been painstakingly reconstructed by FBI technicians, its contents revealing a criminal network even more extensive than they'd imagined. Vincent Carbone was facing life in prison, his organization dismantled, and the men who had terrorized Rebecca and threatened Naomi were either in custody or fled to countries without extradition treaties. Most importantly, Rebecca was healing. The letter that had arrived just that morning brought news that her doctors were finally optimistic about her recovery. The physical injuries were mending, and the psychological trauma was responding to treatment. She might never be the same person who had fled Ohio with her daughter in tow, but she was alive, and she was fighting to rebuild the life that violence had shattered. "Uncle Abram!" Naomi's voice carried across the yard as she succeeded in cornering one of the more docile hens. "Look, Henrietta likes me now." The chicken in question seemed less than enthusiastic about the attention, but it tolerated Naomi's gentle petting with the resigned patience of a creature that had learned to accept the inevitable. Watching them, Abram marveled at how quickly children could adapt, how resilient they were when given love and stability. The sound of buggy wheels on gravel announced a visitor. Bishop Byler approached with his usual measured pace, but Abram noticed a warmth in his expression that hadn't been there during their last conversation about Naomi's presence in the community. "Good afternoon, Abram," the bishop said, settling onto the porch step with a slight grunt. "How are you both doing?" "Well enough," Abram replied. "Naomi's been asking about school. She's curious about the other children in the district. That's actually what I came to discuss." Bishop Baylor watched as Naomi abandoned the chicken and moved on to investigating a patch of interesting weeds. "The community has been talking, and we've reached a decision about her education and her place among us." Abram felt his chest tighten. "And she's family, Abram. Family stays with family. If you're willing to raise her in our ways, to teach her our traditions and values, then she's welcome to stay permanently." The community will support you both. Relief flooded through Abram so powerfully that he had to grip the porch railing to steady himself. Are you certain? The complications, the questions about her background. What complications? Bishop Byler's tone was mild but final. I see a child who needs a home and a man who needs a purpose. Seems straightforward enough to me. That evening, after Naomi had been tucked into bed with her precious handmade doll, Abram sat at his kitchen table composing another letter to Rebecca. The words came easier now, filled with updates about Naomi's progress, her growing vocabulary in Pennsylvania Dutch, her delight in farm animals and simple pleasures. But it was the letter's conclusion that carried the weight of months of reflection. Rebecca, I want you to know that whatever the future holds, Naomi will always have a home here. Not as a burden or an obligation, but as the daughter of my heart, the grandchild Sarah and I never had the blessing to raise. She has brought light back into this old house, purpose back into my days. When you're ready to come for her, and I pray that day comes soon, you'll both be welcome here. There's room for all of us in this family, room for healing, room for new beginnings. The past doesn't have to define us, and the mistakes we've made don't have to be the end of our story. Your daughter is safe, loved, and learning to trust again. She asks about you every day, and I tell her that good mothers always find their way back to their children, that love is stronger than fear or distance or time. Until that day comes, know that she's exactly where she belongs, surrounded by family who would do anything to protect her, in a community that has opened its heart to embrace her as one of their own, with love and hope for brighter days ahead. Uncle Abram. As he sealed the envelope, Abram reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely widower facing financial ruin and the slow death of everything his family had built. Tonight, he was a father figure to a remarkable little girl, a man who had discovered that his capacity for love was far greater than he'd ever imagined. The gun that had saved their lives was locked away in the barn now, cleaned and stored, but never to be forgotten. It represented the price of protecting innocence in a world that didn't always respect such values. The community had struggled with his use of violence, but even the most pacifist among them understood that some things were worth fighting for. From upstairs came the soft sound of a child's voice talking quietly to her doll, sharing the day's adventures and tomorrow's hopes. It was a sound that filled the old house with warmth and possibility, a reminder that even in the darkest times, new life could take root and flourish. Abram walked to the window and looked out at the familiar landscape, the barn with its new roof, paid for with the reward money from the federal case, the pasture where patients grazed contentedly, the vegetable garden where Naomi had already claimed a small plot for her own spring planting. This was home now, not just for him, but for the child who had arrived as a stranger and become the center of his world. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would surely be more, they would face them together as family, with the quiet strength that had sustained generations of Stoltzfus men and women, the heart that had felt most broken. He realized truly did hold the greatest capacity for love. And sometimes, when we've lost everything we thought mattered, we discover what truly does. In the morning, there would be chores to do, lessons to teach, and the endless small joys of watching a child discover the world. Tonight, there was simply gratitude for the unexpected blessing of second chances and the knowledge that family, once found, was never truly lost again.